Hello and welcome back to the podcast. I'm so grateful you're here. I'm super excited about today's episode. I've been looking forward to this ever since we scheduled this. So we we have an amazing author here today. I know you wear many hats, but we we have here today, and again I'm super grateful and excited you're here. We welcome Danielle Bainbridge to the podcast today, assistant professor and author of this amazing book, Dandelion, which is it's such a powerful book, and I'm so excited to talk to you about it. And it's an honor to have you on.
Thank
And
you.
so I want to welcome you to the show. Thank you so much for joining. And with that, without further ado, I want to turn it over to you to introduce yourself. And it would also be great if you could mention the pronouns you go by.
Great. So my name is Danielle Bainbridge, as you said. My pronouns are she, her. I am an assistant professor of theater at Northwestern University outside of Chicago. I also hold courtesy appointments in Black Studies and Performance Studies. Um, Outside of my academic work, I'm a web series creator, writer, and host. I make short films. So I'm kind of a I don't know. Either I'm unfocused or I'm a jack of all trades. Either way you want to frame it. And right now I'm gearing up for the launch of my first book, Dandelion, a memoir and essays, which is a memoir about living with bipolar depression and race and identity in the US as it relates to mental health. And yeah, I'm really excited to be here. I grew up in a town called New Rochelle, New York. It is a medium sized suburban city right outside of New York City. And it is, I often tell people if they don't know New Rochelle, it's the fictional setting of the Dick Van Dyke Show, that, old sitcom. And it is a strange town in the sense that there is a population of people of color, but this town is pretty um I would say like kind of informally segregated in some ways. Like parts of the city are very predominantly white, and then parts of the city are predominantly people of color, and black people. So I think that is also kind of a strange reality of the town itself. And then the neighborhood I grew up in was predominantly white. I moved there when I was about four and a half, almost five, from the Bronx. And, you know, I think a lot of my experience as a young person was a longing to see and interact with more people like me, more people who looked like me, more people who had interests like me, more queer people. Like I just felt a lot of times very out of place. Growing up, I had what I would consider a quite happy like childhood home. I had my parents and my siblings and my extended family, and those things were good, but I still had this longing to want to be um in community more with people who had shared interests to me or shared identity to me. And I think I didn't feel that start to wane until I went to college. Because I went to UPenn, and that's, had a large black student population, and also had, it was in West Philadelphia, which is a predominantly black neighborhood. So I felt a difference when I moved to college, and how great it was not to be one of few or the only one in a situation. And I think that was really healing and wonderful. But a lot of my childhood was spent feeling loved and happy, but also out of place. Kind of like a square peg in a round hole kind of situation. And I think a lot of that drove, in some ways, I don't think it has to, but I think in some ways it drove my creativity and my desire to be creative. I spent a lot of time in my journals writing poetry that was pretty much bad, like writing journal entries, writing short fiction, experimenting with plays, like doing all sorts of things that let my mind work. And I found that to be a great refuge and escape from that feeling of out of placeness. And I think, as I got older and have been able to form the communities that I want and that I feel comfortable in. I live in Chicago, which is a very diverse and very complex city. I think as I've gotten older, a lot of that desire has been sort of met, but it still drives a lot of that creative energy I have, is like wanting to be understood. I think is kind of where it comes down to the heart of it. Is that, even as a young person, I felt like writing was a way to be understood or to explain myself. And today it still is. It still is the primary medium through which I explore the world and I express myself in the world. But it doesn't feel as things don't feel as precarious now as they did as a young person. Because as a young person, you're kind of like, subject to the whims of the adults around you. It's like if your parents decide to move, you're moving. If your parents decide you're going to this school, you're going to that school. Whereas like as an adult, I make all my own decisions and I don't have to worry about those things anymore, and I could be in community with who I want to be. But I still think writing is still like the primary way that I connect with other people.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm going to ask you a question that I was going to ask later, but it came back to me as you were talking. So, because you talked about this search for a place of belonging. And for me, so when I read the book, also like the structure of the book is so interesting because it's essays from different time periods. You tell stories in different like of you being in different localities, and that made it really dynamic, but it also, yeah, it really showed that theme and brought up that theme of like search for belonging that I really loved.
Hmm. Yeah, I think, the structure of the book is kind of interesting because it's had a lot of different structures as time has gone on. Like, when I first was writing it, I think I just was like, put the more interesting stuff at the beginning and then, the less interesting essays at the end or whatever. But I think as time went on, I started to group things thematically more so than chronologically, because all of the essays are, in a strange way, I guess, to me, present tense. They're all from this perspective where I am right now, in my 30s, looking back on all of these experiences from my teens and my childhood and my 20s and my early 30s, etc. But, you know, chronology as a device never felt really helpful to me. Like, just like marching forward through time to tell this story, because it felt more like those nesting dolls that, like there's the one in the center and then you put another one around it and another one around it, and you open them as layers. That's what it felt like to tell this story, was that it was all of a piece, but I was just peeling back the layers to explore these, other incidents in my lifetime. And I think, when I let myself or gave myself permission to not be so concerned about, like, well, this happened first and then this happened second and then this happened third, I was able to experiment more with form and how the essays would unfold. One of the things that I really loved about this collection, about writing it, was that it took about 10 years to write all these essays, so it took a long time. And I'm hoping that my next book won't take that long because I'm like, I can't do one every 10 years. I have to move a little faster than that. But, I think a lot of what I was trying to give myself permission for with form was to experiment and to expand on what an essay could be. Cuz some of the essays are like letters, some of them are free form, some of them are journal, extracts from my journal. Some of them are, told in the second person, the third person, the first person. I wanted to just play around with how they could actually kind of be told and how each story unfolds. One example, I guess, that was like particularly challenging for me to write, but really rewarding, was A Dirge for Girlhood, which is I guess objectively it's like an essay about like my relationship to sex and sexuality, but really it's about the complicated journey I feel like a lot of black girls take with relationship to their body and to sexuality and to being sexualized by other people, but also claiming power in their own sexuality. And I remember when I started that essay, I was like, okay, so this is going to be an essay about virginity and the concept of virginity. And then it just kind of like took whatever form it took. It took me in a lot of unexpected directions. And I realized it was more than that. So I wanted it to be in the second person so that it was something that when people read it, they felt they could identify with it or identify with that experience. But it also takes place over the course of like, like 20 years of my life in just the one essay, starting from my childhood until my mid 20s. And I think giving myself permission to kind of be bolder with form really helped me tell the story that I wanted to tell.
You talk about your experience of growing up with immigrant parents in this town, and I wanted to talk about the intersection of growing up with immigrant parents, growing up in a small town, and that search for home and belonging that is another theme throughout the book, especially in the current environment we find ourselves in.
Hmm. Yeah, so both my parents are Jamaican. They migrated to the US in the 1980s, and then shortly thereafter they got married. They had my sister, then they had me, and then they had my brother. So, they have three kids who were born in the US. When I was a kid, there weren't that many members of my family who lived in the US until maybe I was in like late middle school, so like early high school. So, I guess around 14. I had a lot of family that then migrated to the US over time, but before that, it was pretty much in terms of family, it was me, my siblings, my parents, and then like kind of my parents' chosen family, my mom and dad's friends, our godparents, things like that. I think a lot of my understanding of myself is as a, depending on how you count things, a first or second generation American, depending on how you dictate that. And a lot of my experience as a young person was sort of feeling somewhat different from my peers, in that, like, you know, like if people like I wasn't aware of this until I started having like friends come to our house and not want to eat my parents' food, or you know like going places and people saying like your parents have an accent, or like that sort of being made aware of your difference. And I think a lot of my childhood is shaped by the values that my parents instilled in me, which was that like family came first, that it's important to take care of each other, that really you know me and my siblings like were always encouraged to be close, in part because we didn't have a lot of family, like biological family, in the States. And I think as I've gotten older, I appreciate that, and I appreciate the lessons I was taught as a kid, but it also was sometimes lonely. It felt to me anyway sometimes lonely to not like have other kids who had the same experience as me always. And I did have, a handful of friends who also had Jamaican parents, but for the most part I did not. And I think, as I got older, my like cultural heritage and um my like national heritage as being someone of Jamaican descent became a big part of my identity and a big part of the chosen family that I have now. But I think as a kid it sometimes felt, yeah, it felt lonely. It felt lonely to not always have people who shared the experiences you had.
That is powerful. And you also you brought up chosen family, and that's a big theme on this podcast too.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us more about what friendship and chosen family means to you?
Yeah, I talk a lot about friends and different friends I have in the book. Friendship has always been a really important element of my life. As much as family has always been important to me, and it still is, like, I love my family and I'd do anything for them, but I think there's something about friendship that always felt really special to me, in that I presumed as a kid that I was like, well, your family has to love you, but your friends choose you. And I realize now as I'm older that that is a misconception, because some families do not choose to love you, and some friends, can be horrible. But in my experience, I always over, oversimplified it as a kid to thinking, well, family has to tell me they love me, they have to be supportive, whereas my friends don't have to do that. They're choosing to be around me. And I think as I got older, friendship, I have a lot of very long standing friendships. So I think some of my oldest friends go back to when I was about 10 or 11. So 25 years of friendship now. I have friends from high school, friends from college, grad school, friends from when I moved to Chicago. Basically, from every step of my life, I have different long standing friendships. And I think that support, especially as a queer person, has proven to be really vital to my survival. Friends were people who helped me with my mental health. Friends were people who read all the drafts of my, terrible work until it got better. Like, friends were the people who supported me in addition to my family. I think they always were special to me. And I think I've been also really blessed in that I have a lot of very, very special friends. Friends who are just so kind and so generous and so loving, that I've been fortunate to make connections with. I actually recently just got married to my partner, Amanda, and we were talking afterwards about how nice everyone at the wedding was, how kind all of our family and friends are, how they all got along. And I was saying to Amanda, it's yes, it's nice to see everyone getting along and all that, but it also is just like a testament to the kinds of people we let into our lives. Like, you choose the friends you have. You don't necessarily choose the family you have, biological family, but you choose the community you build as you get older. And I'm really looking forward to it. This is a big year of celebration, because, like, I have two books coming out. We had a wedding, and so it's like a lot of celebration, and I think that's been really lovely to see all my various communities come together and uh and celebrate. That's been great.
Yeah, congratulations. That's a lot of beautiful things happening in a time that is like so devastating in the country and in the world. So I love hearing about celebrations and good things happening, because it shows
Yeah.
us that there's still joy to be found, and that's exactly, I feel like, what will get us through these times. So congratulations on this book, on your upcoming book, which sounds really awesome too. And I can't wait to read that. And on the wedding. That
Yeah.
is lots of really cool stuff happening. One thing that I loved, and that like even starting with the first chapter, what I loved is, there's lots of things that I love, but one thing that struck me right away is how you use your own story and the store and telling stories of other people to draw attention and highlight, yeah, draw attention to systemic issues through individual stories, which I thought was so powerful. And I was wondering if you could talk more about that.
Yeah, so the first essay in the collection actually was the last one to be written. It's called I Think of Jordan, and it's the introduction, and it tells the story of a young man named Jordan, who was murdered on the or killed on the New York City subway by an ex-marine who strangled him to death while he was having a psychiatric crisis, and then later that ex-marine was found not guilty of all charges. So I became interested in that story kind of against my will in some ways. It was big news in and around New York, and I grew up in the suburbs of New York City. So I was following this story and just thinking like how horrible it seemed that someone's life could be taken so abruptly, that someone who was struggling with their mental health and struggling with, their ability to negotiate the world could be so violently taken away. And it just kind of brought back to me so many stories that are similar about Black people who are suffering either mental health or other kinds of crises and then had their lives taken as a result of that. And I think in some ways, when I started writing the memoir, I was interested in telling my own story, like narrating myself and making myself legible to a reader. But I also was interested in how my story was interconnected with a broader set of themes. So, how is my experience as a queer Black woman, child of immigrants, growing up in the early 2000s, how is that connected to other issues of race and identity, class, education, all of these sort of big categories. And I knew that I wanted to tell a story that was connected to something more more pressing than just my personal narrative. I mean, yes, personal narratives are extraordinarily important to me. And I think memoir as a form is very interesting because it allows us to narrate ourselves. But I also wanted to pull on threads that were not explicitly my story, but that still impact me in my thinking, whether that was serving jury duty on a murder trial or, growing up in a predominantly white neighborhood or going to a predominantly white school as a child or, all of these other things. I wanted to show how personal experience could also have some global import. So I think that's kind of where that part of the memoir comes from and why it shaped the way it shaped.
Yeah, I mean, so powerful. And yeah, because you brought up the example of jury duty, which I thought was so powerful too. And I don't want to take away too much from the book because I highly encourage people to read it because it's just awesome. But that example of the jury duty was so interesting because it showed like so many conflicting issues and complex considerations going on for you in terms of, oh, I have these academic job interviews coming up. At the same time, I may be the only Black person on the jury. Like the way you kind of explain and describe those conflicts in your head and how all these like systemic issues came together, I thought that was so powerful, and I was wondering, could you tell us more about that moment and like those conflicting considerations in your head? Because I thought that was so powerful.
Yeah, so I was at the end of grad school when I wrote that essay because I was gearing up to finish my PhD. I had interviews for some jobs. I was quite, anxious all the time, to be honest. My mental health was not very good at the time. I had been hospitalized during grad school. I was just starting to kind of put together that maybe there was some bigger issue at hand than just simple depression or just depression. Not to say that depression in and of itself is not something that people struggle deeply with, but I started to realize that I was like, okay, maybe something else is going on here. And, shortly after I wrote that essay, about a year later, I was diagnosed with bipolar 1. But I came to jury duty that day basically because I wanted to serve and then be excused because I was like, I don't want to actually sit on a jury. This sounds awful. I don't want to be here for the next several weeks and all this other stuff. And then came to realize that I was probably the only Black juror that was going to be called for this particular case at that time. and the defendant was a Black man who was being accused of murder. So I felt all of these conflicting emotions because, on one hand, I, like many Black people, am sometimes very suspicious of the justice system. I don't necessarily think it always works in an unbiased and fair way. In another hand, I was thinking, well, what about, me and my personal interests and my jobs and all these other things. And I think in that moment, I felt very acutely aware of how complicated the decisions that a lot of Black people in the US and, internationally as well, like how complicated these everyday negotiations can be. On one hand, it's mundane and ordinary, it happens every day. On the other hand, there's an incredible moral and emotional weight that you feel when you think, I have this person's fate potentially in my hands. I could be a deciding factor into whether he, you know, serves a life sentence or is just, is acquitted, or all of these sort of conflicting thoughts. And I think in a lot of the essays I have moments like that where I recognize that my personal decision, may also have a bigger lasting global impact. And that's also something to struggle with. Sometimes you want just a simple answer. I think, at least I want just simple answers. And I think oftentimes when faced with these complex situations, even then you want a simple answer. You're like, what, I just want to know yes or no, right or wrong. And m- many times you're not going to get that. And I think that's something that I held on to as I wrote the memoir, was that I'm not here to give simple or uncomplicated answers to folks. It's not a prescriptive memoir in the sense that, this is like a self-improvement book, or a book about instructions on how to live a better life or do this or do that. It's a book of questions more than anything else, to be honest. And I don't have many of the answers to those questions, but I think raising them is still worthwhile.
Yeah, and the way you said it earlier, I can't remember the exact words that you used, but how showing those daily struggles and interactions. I thought that was, yeah, that was done so beautifully in the book. I also want to talk about the raw honesty in your writing about mental health and bipolar depression, because mental health struggles, it's something that personally impacts my life and in my family. So it is and unfortunately it is something that's not talked about enough. And so I really appreciated that raw honesty around mental health, your diagnosis. Could you talk more about what it felt like to share those stories in your book and writing with such raw honesty?
Mm. Honestly, it was kind of terrifying, I think, in some ways. And then I made peace with it, because in some ways it was terrifying in that there were many people in my life who didn't even know some of these things about me, and these are people who are close to me, close friends, family members, things like that, that I just never shared my mental health challenges with. Like, I never told them about it. I never, shared these things with them. And I think some of that came from a feeling of self protection. Like, I didn't want people to ever think of me as not capable, or, damaged, or whatever the, negative connotations and stereotypes we're taught to think of when we think of mental illness or chronic mental illness. And then the other part of it came from, I didn't want people to worry about me. Like, I didn't want people to look at me and think, is she going to be okay? Like, is she going to make it? Is she going to be all right? And so I think those two things, coupled with the kind of ableism that a lot of us internalize, made me very secretive about my mental health challenges for a very long time. And these essays became a way for me to express some of the feelings I had in a safe way. Which is strange because, I was secretive with people who were very close to me, but then I was sharing this information with, objectively strangers. I like, publishing stuff in creative journals and entering contests and stuff and sharing these really intimate private details of my life with people who didn't know me. And in some ways that felt not safer, but less frightening. Because I was like, well, what does it matter? Like, these people don't know me. Who cares what their opinion of me is at the end of the day? But now that the book is coming out and that, people in my life who love me and know me, a lot of them have pre-ordered the book. So I'm like, at this point, I can't say that no one is going to know anymore. And I think a lot of that was also making peace with the idea of being open, of sharing. What does it mean to let people into that part of my life that for so long was a secret thing? And I think in some ways it helps set me free a little bit from that feeling of shame or secretiveness or fear. I was able to open up and say, okay, this is me at my most vulnerable. This is me like completely open to you, and hopefully you can receive me and stay with me and and be okay with that. And some people will read the book and I'm sure not connect with the story and not connect with what's going on, and that's okay. That's also something I've made peace with. I've been in therapy for a long time, so I've made peace with a lot of the realities of what it means to release a book like this. But I also know and I hope that if I could connect to even, just a few people who really needed this book, really needed someone to share that experience with them and to feel less alone in their own experience, whether it's a family member they know that struggles, or they're struggling, or it's a friend that's struggling, or a partner, or some other loved one. Um, I hope that this book can reach out across that distance and give them at least some measure of feeling less alone. And I think in a lot of my own experience, I did feel somewhat alone. Like I said, I had lots of people in my life who loved me, but I think it was also hard for me to admit that I needed help and to lean on that help. And as I've gotten older, I've realized, how fortunate I am to have that army of friends, that army of family members that, really have held me up and loved me and held me to the light. But I wasn't always prepared to receive that. So my hope is for this book that someone who's maybe on that same journey could now be ready to receive this and hopefully find some comfort in that.
That is beautiful. If that's okay for you, I want to
Mhm.
stay on this topic of mental health a little bit more longer. So, because I'm originally, I was born in Austria, but I've been in the States for almost over a decade now, and experiencing my own mental health challenges and navigating the healthcare system around that in the US has been an interesting experience. Let's put it that way. And what I thought was so interesting reading the book is not just reading about it in the perspective of navigating the healthcare system, but what I think is so powerful in the book is how you talk about how your race, queerness, how like those intersections show up when navigating the healthcare system.
Mhm.
And I'm curious if you could talk more about that.
Yeah, so, like many things, it's very complicated because on one hand, like my parents are both healthcare professionals, so I've always had access to healthcare throughout my life, whether that was through having insurance through my parents or through the schools I attended or through my work. So, like, that's always been a constant, is that I've never had a moment in my life where I wasn't able to, like, get the care that I needed. But I will say that some of that care was traumatic. I mean, it wasn't like the care that worked for me. I felt, especially when I was in grad school, a lot of the mental health care providers I met with, even though I was now what I can say is probably a pretty textbook case of bipolar 1, a lot of misdiagnosis happened in my early 20s and late 20s, where folks were like, well, you know, you're in a stressful grad program, or PhDs are hard. And sometimes people just have these issues because they're under, you know, a lot of stress. And people kept telling me that my responses and the things happening to me and the hospitalizations and all this stuff was stress related. And it wasn't until I was 29 that a doctor first told me that she thought I had bipolar depression. And this is like, you know, 4 hospitalizations later, I was like completely shocked, and in some ways, like, angry, because I thought, well, if this is the diagnosis, like, why couldn't they have come to this earlier? Why did I have to go through all this bullshit? Like, I hate this. You know, I was very angry for a long time about the whole situation, but I also didn't necessarily accept the diagnosis right away. I think because the depictions I saw of bipolar depression 1, especially, were not positive. Like, any sort of major mental health issue like bipolar depression 1, you know, schizophrenia, like any of these diagnoses, like when I would see representation of those illnesses like in TV or movies or anything like that, you know, usually the person was kind of represented as being past uh past any sort of redemption. You know, like, this person is irreparably damaged, they're broken, they're unable to function, they're you know, almost like a, like I said, like this internalized ableism about what it means to live with chronic mental health issues. And there's a lot of ways that people live with mental health and mental illness. I think for me, I've been very fortunate in that, like I said, I've always had access to healthcare. So now I'm able to take medication and go to therapy and do things that sustain and stabilize my mood and my mental health. But, you know, it came so late that it almost felt like angering to me, that I thought, well, if, you know, if someone had listened to me, maybe I could have avoided some of this heartache. Um and it's interesting because, you know, I've seen stories where black women and girls are like misdiagnosed often, like, you know, given a major diagnosis that isn't correct. And then I've seen stories where they're underdiagnosed. So it's like, you know, wrestling with both of those things, I think I wanted to give voice to my own story, but also, like I said, frame it within a larger narrative of these bigger societal issues. And part of that was also critiquing the kind of healthcare we get and how that healthcare can be harmful and damaging. And I think I am very, very, very fortunate. I acknowledge, like, the privilege I have in that now I've been able to find a healthcare team that really works for me, that's able to help me, that I know how to advocate for myself, that I know what to ask for and what to look for. But on the same note, I wish it didn't have to come at so high a cost. Like, I wish I could have learned some of these things without all of the negative aspects as well. So it's complicated because I think, you know, I could be happy that in the end things are okay, but I also feel, you know, a certain level of annoyance, anger, you know, lingering resentment that it took so long. Um and so much challenge to get there.
Yeah, and that is like a tension that I also felt throughout the book, especially I think it was the first chapter when you talked about the tragic killing of Jordan Neely, and you reflected on, and again, I don't want to like take too much away from the book, but you reflected on, oh, like what if I didn't have the resources I have? What if I didn't have health care? Could the same thing be happening to me?
Yeah, I think about it often. Like a lot of people who struggle or are not diagnosed or don't get the medication they need oftentimes can end up in dire situations. And I think we're also taught to be afraid of people with mental illness. And I think reflecting on Jordan's story, I realized that I was like, yeah, maybe sometimes when I was experiencing mania or psychosis or, other like things that are scary to witness, maybe I made people afraid. Maybe I made my family afraid. Maybe I made my friends afraid. Maybe I made strangers afraid, like because I was acting irregularly or irrationally. But I wonder why it is that people's fear of mental illness needs to necessitate that someone should be harmed or that someone should lose their life in Jordan's instance. And I think it's hard for me to struggle with that question because I want to recognize also in the essay, like in that first chapter, I implicate myself and say, I have reacted similarly when faced with people who are experiencing mental health crises. Like, I have walked away, I've looked away, I've, switched subway cars, I've done all of those things to get away from someone who's suffering because I have been taught, even as someone with a similar diagnosis, that people with mental illness are, you know, can be dangerous. Like we have to be afraid of them. And actually, that's like that idea is dangerous because in many ways, when people are struggling or suffering, you know, it's not necessarily that they're violent or that they want to be violent. It's that they're just, like I know when I've experienced extreme mental health crises, like I feel very out of control. Like I don't have a lot of control over what's happening or what's happening around me. And I think a lot of times, our own desire to separate ourselves or differentiate ourselves from people with mental illness also comes from an ableist desire to say like, well, I'm not like that person, or I'm not as bad as him, or I'm not, as bad as her, or whatever. And I think, even as someone, like when I was first diagnosed, I remember thinking and like Googling bipolar depression and just looking it up and then reading the symptoms and reading some of the diagnostic, measures and thinking, that's not me. Like, there's no way I'm like that. There's no way that I fit into that category. I'm not like that. You know, I'm not, um, I'm not that person. And then the longer I sat with it, I started thinking, well, that has happened to me, or that is a symptom that I have, or, why is it that I'm so resistant to hearing this? And I think it's in part because we associate it with with being out of control, with being someone who is beyond repair. And I think that's one of the most damaging things that uh we kind of put on people who have mental illness is that, we think of them as sort of a caricature of a person, of an out of control person, but we don't think of them as fully realized whole people with complexity and interior lives and, other kinds of desires. Like, I just wanted to write this to add some complexity to the story.
Yeah, and I really I love that. So because my growing up, my father was bipolar, and I'm continuously on my mental health exploration journey. But I remember even growing up, I remember whenever I saw someone on TV or in a movie struggling from a mental illness, yeah, it was always out of control, like not really like showing our day-to-day lives with the struggles, but also with the things that everyone else is struggling with too. And I do wonder, like, having a lack of access in our media, a lack of access to representation, accurate depictions of mental health, like how much that is robbing us of being able to have honest, raw, vulnerable conversations around these topics in our everyday lives.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does. So often, the story of mental illness is narrated from someone who is like a bystander more so than the person who is struggling or is, has this diagnosis. So it's coming from a perception of, oh my God, like this person is talking to themselves or they're doing this or they're acting irregularly. And I think that judgment is kind of inherent to that kind of narrative. It's coming from a place where we're thinking of it as someone who is okay and then someone who's not okay. And when we structure that binary, it kind of takes away the person who's struggling's humanity because it's saying that they're almost less human, like, less able to articulate themselves. It takes away their agency. And I think a lot of media is, I mean, media is constructed in a certain way because it's for entertainment usually. And in the same way people watch like true crime or, listen to like true crime podcasts because there's that feeling of, interest, but also, oh my God, at least it's not me, that sort of weird thing that people do. I think that that's sometimes how people look at mental illness is, oh well, at least I'm not like that, or at least I'm not that person. And that can be very painful to hear when people articulate that sort of thing. It even, like, after I was diagnosed, I remember becoming more aware of people saying things like calling someone bipolar as an insult, to say like, oh, my boss is so bipolar, to mean that they have extreme moods or they're not kind, and hearing that like kind of weaponized language started to bother me because I was like, I'm not separate from the struggles I have, but I'm also, that's not the sum total of who I am. And I think, a lot of our media diet does steer towards this sort of individualistic look at things where it's like it's about me and my perspective and who I am, and it's not about the community or our communal experience. And I think I wanted to write something that was more about, like, yes, it's about me, but it's also about the people I'm in community with, the people who I interact with every day, the systems I interact with every day, so that it was less about like this individualism and more about a collective.
You touched on the media representations, because again, it's like very stereotypical depictions of mental health, then also makes it harder for us to get to that place of like, oh, maybe like that's what I'm struggling with. Because I remember in my 20s, when I've always struggled with depression, but in my 20s when it got really bad again, and I always thought, I this can't be depression, because all I knew was about depression was from TV, of
Hmm.
like, oh, you lay in bed and you cry all day, and that's like depression. But I was
Hmm.
able to do stuff. I didn't feel good doing stuff. I had never heard of high functioning depression, didn't know what that was. But for me, it was like, as long as I'm productive, there's no problem.
Hmm.
And I think, yeah, that's like where those stereotypical and limited media representations really, in more than one way, that do us a disservice, because, yeah, it doesn't bring the systemic piece, and then also these limited depictions also again don't give us those role models or examples of what struggling with mental health issues looks like
Mm-hmm.
and how that impacts different people, if that makes
Mm-hmm.
sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it you know, everyone is different, right? Like, I think for the last 6 years or so, my mental health has been quite good because I found the right combination of therapy and medication and, behavioral tricks and things to help me stabilize. But I also think that not everyone is the same, which is kind of why I didn't want to write like a self help book, like, no shade to self help, but I didn't want to write a book that was like, here's how you can fix yourself, or here's how you can, improve your mental health in 10 easy steps, or, something of that nature. Because one, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a social worker, I'm not any of those people who are qualified to make any of these kind of judgments. And two, I wanted to show a sort of unfiltered version of what my journey looked like, but also reinforce the fact that, like, every journey will look different. It's not always about, I think when people think of bipolar depression, they think like mood swings, like very, very happy and then very, very sad and then, kind of that. But I wanted to just offer a more nuanced perspective.
Before I ask you to share where people, listeners, can find you, I want to ask you a few questions that I ask all of my guests.
Yeah.
And I would love to start with, can you tell us about a time the kindness of a stranger has made a difference in your life?
Yeah, so I actually write about this in the book and in the memoir. I got lost the first day I moved to New Rochelle, and walked out of the front door and just like got lost on the street. I was four and a half, five, and just like walked the neighborhood for like an hour and got lost. And then a kind woman stranger was outside having a cigarette, and she saw me and took me into her home and returned me to my parents. And as a child, I just thought, like, okay, yeah, that's natural, like that's what adults do. And as an adult, I realized how fortunate that is that I was found by this like kind woman. So, shout out to her if she's listening to the podcast, that she really did make a big difference and return me to my family.
Yeah, I mean that is awesome, and I always like think, oh, I would love to, because so I ask this almost all of my guests, and I'm always thinking it would be so awesome if one of those people would hear that story at some point, because I always feel like people don't understand how they've impacted our lives and how much
Mhm.
difference they made. And so I hope one day someone hears one of their stories, because yeah, I love hearing those stories. And then another question I wanted to ask you is, what would you tell your 13-year-old self?
Mm. I would tell my 13-year-old self that you'll be the person that you wanted to be when you get older, and you'll be we'll be proud of ourselves. I think that was something I struggled with as a young person, and I would, yeah, I would love to tell my 13-year-old self that, like, you'll be proud of yourself when you get older.
I love that. And then one more question for you. Can you tell us about a song that has made a difference in your life?
Hmm, that's a good one. I think the first one that comes to mind is probably Bob Marley, "No Woman, No Cry." My dad used to sing that song to us a lot as kids, and in my head I was like, oh, this is a great song. I thought it was like basically written for us. There's a line where he says like Georgie would make the fire, and my mom's like pet name, her nickname from nursing school, is Georgie. So in my head I was like, oh yeah, like it's a song about us. Like, I thought it was literally about my parents and me. But as I got older, the the music and the import of the message has really resonated with me, and it has good good like memories for me, that song.
Thanks for sharing. And I know we're coming at the end of our time here. And I want to say again, such an honor to have you on. I'm so grateful that, especially during this busy time for you with the book launch, I'm feeling very honored and privileged to have you on the podcast. Thank you
Oh,
so much
thank
for
you.
joining us. And to everyone listening, again, it's such a great book. And I love your honesty, the structure, just everything. It's an awesome book, and I highly recommend everyone pick it up. And so before we come to the end, I would love to ask you where people can find you and where they can get your book.
Yeah, so you can get the book basically anywhere that books are sold. You can get it, I'm recommending people get it on bookshop.org. Dandelion, a memoir and essays by Danielle Bainbridge. There are a couple other books with Dandelion in the title, so you'll see those, but if you keep scrolling with my last name, you'll find it there. But you could also get it through like Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, like all the booksellers. And then you can find me on Instagram at quirky professor underscore. You could find me on Blue Sky at Danielle.Bainbridge at Blue Sky. And then I have a Twitter account, but I haven't been really active there in a long time. But you could find me on Twitter, or X, I should say, I guess, at Quirky Professor. And yeah, those are all the kind of social media platforms I'm active on right now. But if you guys are interested and want to connect, please reach out.
Thank you so much. And your next book is coming, the academic book is coming out in 2026, correct?
Yeah, January 27th, 2026, I want to say. It's called Currencies of Cruelty, Slavery, Freak Show, and the Performance Archive. It's coming out through NYU Press, and you can find it on NYU Press's website for pre order, or you could buy it through bookshop.org or Amazon or any of those other platforms.
Thank you again for joining us. What an insightful and impactful conversation. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. And yeah, good best of luck with all of the with the book launch, all of the wonderful things happening. It's yeah, it sounds like a really exciting time.
Yeah, absolutely. Tiring, but exciting.
Thanks again so much.
Thank you.